Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to look at the major themes in chapters 32 and 33 of Jürgen's The Prize. Our primary focus in this session is the title of chapter 32, The Adjustment. That is, the policies and the strategies that the Western oil-consuming nations pursued to solve the problem of the OPEC oil-producing countries' policies of the mid and late 1970s. Now, much like some of the other themes that we have looked at, some of this material Jürgen first introduces in earlier chapters, and many of these are long-term policy changes, and so he's going to keep referring back to them in chapters 33 through to the end of the book. But what we're primarily interested in is this major shift in strategies from reliance on primarily the Middle East oil-producing countries to two broad strategies. One is to discover new sources of oil, to bring in new oil discoveries to supplement the oil that the OPEC countries are withdrawing from the world market. And then secondly, the development of conservation policies. That is the first serious sustained effort to reduce the consumption of oil in the oil-consuming nations. Now, the first step in the oil-consuming nation strategy is to form an organization. So Jürgen, at the beginning of chapter 32, describes the origins of the International Energy Agency, which really was an initiative by Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. And the point is essentially to create an organization that will be a counterbalance to OPEC and the oil-producing countries. So if you look on the map on your screen, this is a contemporary map. If those darkest blue shaded countries are the original members of the IEA. And if you look at them, it's pretty obvious. Most of them are pretty obvious if you look in the Western European countries, plus the Scandinavian countries and Turkey. And then on the east side of the map, you have Japan and Australia. But what's interesting, if you look at on the left-hand side of the map in North America, you see Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So these are, in essence, the Western oil-consuming countries, and they all make pretty good sense with the one exception of Mexico, which is really curious here. Mexico has far more in common with countries like Venezuela and Iran. That is to say, they have sort of semi-developed industrial economies. They're not as primitive as a place like, say, Kuwait or Libya would be severe examples, but they certainly don't have as advanced an industrialized economy as places like the United States and Britain and France. Mexico is a net oil exporter, right? It should have, logically, more in common with the OPEC countries, and particularly if you recall our discussion of the politics of nationalization, the nationalization of oil in Mexico takes a particularly radical form, that is, complete expropriation of the property of the Western oil companies. And so there's many reasons to think that Mexico should be part of OPEC. In fact, like Venezuela, you would think that it might well be in the kind of radical vanguard of OPEC. But you see just the opposite here, that Mexico joins the International Energy Agency. That is, it aligns itself with the oil-consuming countries, which is a reflection of the relationship between the United States and Mexico. Mexico is not free to determine its own international relationships in the way that other countries, even a country like Venezuela, is able to do, because they are such close neighbors with the United States, and because of the sort of the political consequences besides the effect on the oil economy of Mexico splitting away would be so severe for them that they get sort of rallied into the IEA. So the IEA is a way of sort of formalizing those ad hoc committee organizations. If you recall, in the aftermath of the 67 embargo, the consuming countries were able to get together and reroute shipments of oil to get around the embargo and whatnot. by the 73-74 embargo, they had not sustained any kind of international organization to allow that to happen again. And so there was just chaos in 73 and 74 because they had never formalized those arrangements that they had come up with in 67. That's fundamentally what the IEA, what its initial kind of mandate for action to do is. So we have to gather together as the oil consuming countries, and we have to come up with policies that will counter whatever OPEC does to us. Over time, as you can see, there are any number of additional, what are called here on this map, accession countries and association countries. The IEA is going to become wrapped up in with United Nations initiatives around energy, the International Atomic Energy Agency and whatnot. But here in its origins, it's really like the counter OPEC cartel, the cartel to represent the interests of the consuming nations. The number one mandate or priority of the consuming nations in response to the OPEC oil crisis is to discover new sources of oil, right? And there's nothing new about this. The oil companies have been exploring all over the world for deposits for 100 years at this point. So there's nothing new in this strategy, but there is a new constraint imposed on the consuming countries. They are interested in discovering new supplies of oil in friendly countries, right? They perceive that one of the great weaknesses of Middle East oil, it's wonderful because there's so much of it and you can get it so cheap, but that oil is in highly unstable countries, right? And so if Mobil's going to go into Iraq, or if Esso is going to be in Libya, one of the kind of dire circumstances of drilling for oil in places like that is you're going to be endlessly facing revolutions and unstable governments and kind of tyrant dictator thugs trying to beat up your oil executives to demand more oil, right? That these are essentially kind of Wild West places, and that what we really need to find are more oil reserves within the territories or the jurisdictions of the Western powers. And so that leads us first to Alaska, and this is an example of a topic. Jürgen first introduces the early exploration of Alaska in chapters 27 and 28, so quite a few chapters earlier in this, but Alaska is going to come on in a major way in response to the oil embargo. The exploration for oil in Alaska presents enormous engineering challenges. It is the most hostile climate and environment that anyone has yet been searching for oil. Compared to the Arctic Circle, right? The deserts of Saudi Arabia look like Palm Springs, right? It looks like a vacation spot. We're talking about getting all of your materials for doing the drilling to the furthest reaches of the North American land mass. We're particularly interested, if you look on the map on your screen, that north shore of Alaska, that NPR that you see, that gray area designated as the National Petroleum Reserve. And that's an area of federal lands set aside specifically for oil exploration. And then just to the east of the National Petroleum Reserve is that Prudhoe Bay, which is the major kind of port infrastructure pipeline area that the oil industry of northern Alaska will be built around. So we face first an enormous challenge in just getting people and supplies and materials to that location. The Bering Sea is frozen. Those northern reaches of the Bering Sea are frozen for 6 or more months out of the year. So you have a limited time when that ice breaks up and kind of channels open up in the Bering Sea so that you can even get ships to port. So essentially all of your drilling supplies have to be unloaded during the summer, and then you're essentially stranded other than air traffic, right? You can get light airplanes into Prudhoe Bay for roughly 6 months of the year. And of course, the other great challenge is drilling through ice. And this is a new technology that's first worked out in the 60s. Jürgen tells you that the American oil company Arco first hits oil in 1968, so they've been up there for several years trying to work this out. And of course, the problem with ice is, first of all, it can be any amount of thickness. You might have, say, 10 feet of ice that you have to punch through. You could easily have 100 feet or more of ice that you have to punch through before you can even get to the geologic substratum, right? So first you have to navigate through and find out where the oil is, by first penetrating, tens or hundreds of feet of ice. But even more importantly is that ice is constantly shifting, right? If you have 100 feet of ice, there's multiple layers of those ice sheets, and they slide back and forth over each other before you ever get to hard ground. So you put your drilling rig on top of the top layer of ice, and that's a big enough challenge, right, to clear the snow and get all the gear there. But as soon as you poke a hole in the ground, you come back a couple months later, and your oil rig is now 10 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet in one direction or another relative to the geologic substratum, right? Relative vertically to that substratum, your oil rig might be, tens of feet, tens of yards, hundreds of yards away from where you thought you were originally drilling. So you have to be able to track, your location on the surface and the location of the hole you're trying to hit any number of feet below that, and compensate for the way the drill rig is kind of floating around. This is a great engineering challenge in the 1960s that several American companies have been working on. And as I mentioned, Jürgen tells you Arco makes the first big breakthrough in 1968. The other great challenge posed by drilling for oil in the Arctic Circle is, if you are successful in discovering oil and getting it to the surface, how do you transport it back to the mainland? Again, if you're going to load it on ships out of Prudhoe Bay, those ships are really only going to be able to travel 6 months of the year at best. And so there's just no way to have the size of storage facilities that you would need. You'd essentially need to store up 6 months worth of drilling, where you're just putting the oil into huge containers to unload into ships in the summer. So that's not practical. To build a pipeline across the Alaskan Peninsula, if we want to call it that, the across Alaska, is a engineering feat out of all proportion to any kind of pipeline work that's been done before. It is nearly 1,000 miles from Prudhoe Bay on the north coast of Alaska down to the port of Valdez on the southern coast on the Gulf of Alaska. The closest thing to this, Jürgen discussed the Trans-Arabian pipeline that was built in 1947, which is some 600 miles long, so on the scale of this. But there, of course, you're trying to traverse more or less flat desert, right? Certainly there are big sand dunes, but nothing on the scale of the mountains of Alaska. And if you think back, our discussion of the origins of pipelines all the way back in the 1870s, the first pipelines built in the mountains of Pennsylvania, you are essentially trying to go down the mountain, right? You're starting up a couple thousand feet up in the mountains, and you're going down to the Lake Huron shoreline. And though you may go up and down with the pipeline, as long as you're overall progressing from higher to lower, gravity is going to be a tremendous asset, right? It's going to assist the flow of that pipeline. Doesn't mean you can go up steep inclines with a pipeline, but it does mean you can do long flat sections and even gently rolling hills, as long as you're going to ultimately end up lower than you start. Well, if you see the maps of Alaska here on your screen, and you imagine, if you look at that northern point at Prudhoe Bay, you're basically at sea level, right? You're at the level of the ocean. Look at the southern terminus down there in Prince William Sound. You are at sea level again, so you're basically going from 0 to 0. But you have to traverse some of the tallest mountain peaks in the world to get there. So the Alaskan pipeline is going to require pumping stations, hundreds and hundreds of pumping stations, particularly on the northern half, right? It requires much more pressure to pump oil uphill. Once you get over the highest peaks and you're down on the lower side, then you need fewer pumping stations. But the other thing that makes Alaskan oil so difficult is how cold it is, because of course in freezing temperatures, or even close to freezing temperatures, oil becomes extremely viscous, right? It becomes thick and it doesn't move. So not only the distance and the pumping uphill, essentially, but if you look at that picture of the pipeline there on your screen, that's essentially a double-walled tube. And in the inner wall, the oil flows, but between the inner and the outer walls are kind of radiator pipes filled with, I don't know if it's water or some kind of fluid that's heated, and that heats the pipeline to keep the oil viscous enough that it will flow. Now, again, you're talking about nearly 1,000 miles of double-walled pipe and maintaining these water tubes, heated water tubes, to keep the oil warm enough that it will flow. And both of these aspects are revolutionary in pipeline technology. The Trans-Alaskan Pipeline is a major technological innovation, and it's going to open up Arctic drilling all over the planet. The largest map on the left-hand side of your screen is a modern map, and it just shows you how integrated the American and the Canadian pipeline system have become. When the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline was first finished in, I think, 1976, it's just that northernmost portion that cuts straight across Alaska. Between the late 70s and the present day, we have integrated thousands of miles of Canadian pipeline. You see that little cluster there in Western Canada. That's in the province of Alberta. And if you have heard of Canadian tar sands, right, which is a unique kind of geologic formation, the tar sands are going to be discovered and developed in the 1990s. That pipeline system comes and you see all that Alaskan oil funnels into the Canadian pipeline system, and that Canadian pipeline system ultimately feeds the industrial Midwest and Northeastern America, and then the other great branches go all the way down to the Gulf Coast and end up in that refinery center around the Gulf of Mexico outlet that we've talked about before. The chart on the lower right-hand portion of the screen shows the flow of oil through the Alaskan pipeline. It's going to peak in the mid-80s at around 2 million barrels per day and then steadily decline thereafter. The second major area in which new oil reserves were discovered as part of the adjustment is the North Sea. Now, we typically, if you see a map of Europe, we don't get a very good view of the North Sea because it's sort of just beyond the scope of the map, the area beyond Northern Europe. But the image in the upper right-hand corner of your screen gives you a good image. The North Sea really is a kind of inland sea that unites Great Britain, the Scandinavian countries, and then the countries on the north coast of Europe. And it has been a it's kind of like a little Mediterranean or a little Caribbean here. There's an active ship traffic that goes back to the pre-modern era in this region known as the North Sea. So in response to the oil embargo, the OPEC oil embargo policies and reduction of production, of their oil production, these European countries are going to start exploring off the coast of Great Britain and off the coast of Norway. Now, you see the problem in that map in the upper right-hand corner of your screen is that these are international waters. So before this oil can be brought into production, one of the first things that has to happen is the international boundaries of all these countries. How far out into the North Sea do they extend so that when we discover oil, we know which oil belongs to whom, right? That all has to be worked out, and this is really one of the first prominent functions of the International Energy Agency. It was exactly to help facilitate these kinds of negotiations that the IEA was first created. And you see the boundaries that are ultimately created, and it's going to require an international conglomerate of oil companies. If you see the image on the lower left-hand side, these are the major oil company partners. Now, you're familiar with a few of them. ExxonMobil, we've talked about, British Petroleum, and Shell. We've not mentioned Total before. That's the French national oil company. It was the CFP, if you remember our discussions of the Red Line Agreement. The CFP becomes Total in the post-World War II period, and the major new player is this Equinor, which is Norway's state oil company. So these companies from these different, and the French and the Norwegians taking a prominent role here is really a new thing. We've not seen those two countries be major players in any of the other oil concessions that we've talked about, but Norway especially really becomes the lead partner of this conglomerate. They're going to start oil production. You can see the chart on the upper left-hand portion of the screen. Production really takes off in 1975-76, and it's going to peak through through the 1990s at some 6 million barrels a day. In other words, roughly triple what the Alaskan pipeline was producing at its peak. And just like drilling in Alaska required a whole new series of engineering innovations to tackle the problems of drilling for oil in the Arctic Circle, so too the exploration and extraction of oil in the North Sea is going to lead to a whole series of engineering innovations around deep sea drilling. You see these deep sea drilling rigs in the photos in the upper left hand portion of your screen. These are absolute technological marvels. It is just mind-boggling to understand what it is required. These are just floating islands out in the middle of the sea, right? And so the ability just to sort of track your position by GPS. So these oil stations have motors in their bases, and you have to be constantly adjusting your position. You can see the development of the technology in the illustration in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. From about the mid-70s forward, these are just free-floating platforms that have to be sustained in their position above the spot on the floor of the sea that you're trying to drill. And the map in the upper right-hand corner gives a really nice illustration of the expansion of deep-sea drilling with the development of these new technologies. If you read this chart, the white dots represent the earliest drilling efforts up to 1974, and the size of the dots show you the depth at which they're drilling. And so really up to 74, virtually all those dots are up to 1,000 feet deep in the sea. And if you look at that map, you can see the kind of underwater ledge. They're just chasing that ledge, which is just the runoff of the Mississippi River Delta that's flowed out into the Gulf of Mexico and created that ledge. They're pushing further and further out onto that ledge. But after, starting in 1975, you start to see the gray dots, and not only deeper gray as we go further in time, but those gray dots are overwhelmingly bigger than the white dots. That is, we're starting to come out to 2,500 feet deep, even 5,000 feet deep along the Gulf of Mexico shoreline. And you can see in the illustration in the lower right-hand corner, up until 1974, roughly, we were still working with fixed foundation drill rigs, right? Essentially just building giant radio antenna towers and submerging them below and trying to anchor it to the sea floor and then putting our drill bit down the middle of that antenna. Essentially the same drilling technology that we were using on land, just trying to make it waterproof and stay in one place on the sea floor. Starting in 1975, you see the emergence of these floating oil rigs. And so these are just little islands bobbing and weaving out on the sea surface. You have a hole that can be up to, ultimately up to 10,000 feet below the sea surface. In this time period, several thousand feet, 3, 4, 5,000 feet below the sea surface. And that drill rig, that floating island, is bobbing and weaving in the waves, and it's got to find that hole in the sea floor 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet below the waves. The engineering that's required, right? The computer modeling and the ability to GPS position yourself over that hole is just absolutely mind-blowing, right? It's sort of, I always look at these and I think the landing on the moon was kind of putt-putt golf compared to the engineering achievement of these oil rigs. Now the map on the lower left-hand side of your screen shows the way in which this development is going to open up deep sea exploration throughout the world. All those little dots on the map on the lower left-hand screen are all locations of deep sea exploration. The development of deep sea drilling rigs is going to open up essentially, the 2/3 of the planet, the 3/4 of the planet covered by ocean waters that had not been accessible for the first 100 years of the oil industry. And it's going to create massive new oil deposits and oil reserves that are going to come online really starting in the late 80s, but especially in the 1990s and the 2000s. This deep sea drilling oil is going to come onto the international market in a very serious way. This is a kind of generational leap in drilling technology, the development of these deep sea drilling rigs. Another component of the adjustment is the search for new types of energy, not just new sources of the old forms of energy. And most prominently above this is electricity generated with nuclear power. If you look at this image in the middle of the screen on the top, the kind of little illustration of the nuclear power process, it really could not be any simpler. This image can take you all the way back to that Watson-Bolton steam engine from the 1760s, if you recall, one of our first, probably was our first class session. All we're doing here is creating heat with nuclear reaction. With that heat generated, we're boiling water. We're using that steam pressure to turn a turbine, which is going to generate electricity. It could not be simpler. Of course, it could not be more dangerous and more, consequential or dramatic in its implication. But the actual technology of a nuclear electricity generator is really 100, 200 years old at this point. And so if you look at the chart on the lower left-hand side of your screen, you see the emergence there in the highlighted portion. That green line is nuclear electric power, which was almost non-existent before 1970, and then you see that dramatic rise in the use of nuclear power plants to generate electricity starting in the 70s. The countries that are going to be most aggressive in developing their nuclear electrical capacity are those advanced industrial countries that don't have their own domestic oil supplies. Now, if you look at the chart on the upper right-hand side of your screen, we would expect to see the United States and Russia on any list of nuclear powers because, of course, they both have huge nuclear weapons arsenals and the infrastructure to create, highly refined uranium. So they're very well suited for the transition to using nuclear power to generate electricity. But look at the other countries on this list. And again, this is there's a 2000 chart, so it goes beyond the time period of Jürgen's text, but it's going to be essentially these same countries. It's France, Korea, Japan, Germany. China's not such an important player here in this period, but India is as well. And what are these countries? What do they all have in common? These are all advanced industrial economies, but they don't have their own domestic source of oil. So they're driven to nuclear power as the best alternative to oil and petroleum. Now, if you look at the chart in the lower part of your screen, it shows the number of new nuclear reactors being launched or certified to be built within the United States. And you see that peak right around 1980 and then a sharp decline. And that's really important to understand. In the very first stages of nuclear power, or at least nuclear power used for electricity generation, there was very little understanding or a minimal understanding of the dangers posed by nuclear waste, right? That the nuclear reactors could melt down, etc. It's only after 3 Mile Island, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute, that the dangers of nuclear power become evident. And at that point, the United States government, the federal government, is going to start imposing very rigid, very severe safety requirements on the construction of new nuclear reactors. And at that point, they become so expensive to build to meet all of these federal regulations for safety. You have to have triple and quadruple redundancy systems to every potential contingency. By the time we impose those regulations, nuclear power reactors are going to become just astronomically expensive, prohibitively expensive, and that's what you see the decline on that chart is the imposition of federal regulations make the construction of new nuclear reactors really economically unfeasible. But it's important to understand that sequence of the sense of the fears. And when nuclear power is first rolled out, people had very little sense of the dangers of a nuclear meltdown or the problems of how do we dispose of uranium waste, things that we have since become very well familiar with. Instead of the problem of nuclear meltdowns or what to do with nuclear waste, by far more controversial in relationship to nuclear power generation is nuclear power's association with bombs and missiles and the Cold War, right? That through the 1950s and the 1960s, both the Soviet Union and the United States stockpiled tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, many times more than they would actually ever need in a war to be able to completely obliterate the other side. And this thinking about nuclear weapons went under the rubric of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And this is understood as the only psychology that can secure international peace. That is to say, uh, I have to be assured, if I'm a nuclear power, say I'm the United States and I'm facing off against the Soviet Union, the only way the world can be safe is if both the United States and the Soviet Union come to understand that the other side has so many nuclear weapons that they could never knock them all out, right? That no matter what happens, if I launch an attack against you, I could never be so complete to eliminate all your forces. So no matter what, you're going to have enough nuclear weapons to knock me out in return. We are both mutually assured of our destruction the minute either one of us launches a nuclear strike. And that is the idea is that sense of certainty of our own destruction is what would prevent either side from actually launching a nuclear war. And so nuclear, sort of civilian nuclear energy power is always associated in the public mind with nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war. Now, this plays a relatively small role within the United States, but it has a major influence in European politics. Europeans are always more sensitive to the threat of nuclear war than the Americans ever were, and plenty of Americans live in fear and terror of a Soviet nuclear strike. But the Europeans think, well, you Americans and you Russians are just going to lob your missiles at each other, but you're going to lob them at each other's forces in Europe. We're going to be sitting under the bullseye when all these nuclear bombs start falling, and you Americans are going to be hiding out there in North America. And, maybe you get Omaha knocked out, but you're not going to have your whole civilization wiped out. We here in, the Netherlands or in France or in Spain or Portugal, we're going to have our entire territory obliterated in the first couple hours of the war. And so the opposition to nuclear weapons, because of course if you live in France, it's not the French nuclear weapons, it's these damn American nuclear weapons that are parked on French soil, right? So there's an easy and a very important opposition to nuclear weapons, particularly in Europe. And so if you think about the circumstance of a place like France, they are going to be the most aggressive nuclear civilian power generating country in the world because they're in this dilemma. They want to be an advanced industrial economy. They want an economy based on, electricity and petroleum and whatnot, but they have no domestic sources. They're in this terrible pinch where they have to separate themselves from the United States in order to not make the Arab countries, the OPEC countries, any more mad at them and, embargo them and drive up their oil prices. Nuclear power is a clear, smart alternative to that. But in France, they're going to run up against the domestic opposition, the opposition to nuclear weapons. So again, this plays a comparatively smaller role in American politics, but it is, and Japan would be in a very similar circumstance to France, would have a similar kind of constraints around both their energy sources and their geopolitical alliances. And so in both of those countries, nuclear power is going to be their leading, alternative source of energy they're going to develop, but it is extremely controversial in their domestic politics. Thinking about the opposition to nuclear weapons then is a nice segue into the broader environmentalist movement. If anti-nuclear was not as significant a factor in American politics, all the other elements of the environmentalist movement certainly were, and many of them originated in the United States. For the first time in American history, and maybe in global history, starting in the late 1960s and picking up speed through the mid-1970s, more and more people are becoming aware of the potential cataclysmic effects of pollution and accidents and spills related to the oil industry. There are are a couple of kind of celebrity events, celebrity crises in 1969. The first you see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, just outside of Santa Barbara, California. Santa Barbara is just north of Los Angeles. One of the offshore oil rigs had an accident and started spilling oil, and for weeks and weeks, oil was pumping out of the oil rig and landing right up on the beaches of Southern California. If you're at all familiar with the Exxon Valdez spill in Prince William Sound in 1989, that became a much more famous case of an oil spill. The Santa Barbara oil spill was kind of the originator of that, or the first great oil spill. And because Santa Barbara is a pretty wealthy community just on the north side of Los Angeles, it became very well publicized. That is to say, the kind of Hollywood culture in Los Angeles made a big deal about their beaches being ruined, and it appeared on the news in all the major newspapers in a way that it might not have, say, if it had happened somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, or if it happened in Alaska or some more remote place. Because the oil spill was right in the middle of Southern California, it got an extraordinary amount of news coverage. Another event in 1969 was the Cuyahoga River fire. The Cuyahoga River is the river in northeastern Ohio that runs just outside of Cleveland. And if you recall, Cleveland was the site of the earliest refining facilities in the oil industry. And by the post-World War II period, there were any number of kind of petrochemical processing factories, paint factories and fertilizer factories and all kinds of things based on the Cuyahoga River, kind of a building out of Cleveland's industrial capacity. Well, in 1969, the Cuyahoga River lit on fire, spontaneously combusted into fire, because it was so concentrated and polluted with petrochemicals that the water itself burst into flames. And the river fire is going to last. It's very difficult to put out. You can kind of you can't really pour water on it. And the image that you see in the middle of your screen, those fire hoses are really just kind of keeping that fire clumped together, right? It's kind of pushing it together. But pouring water on top of a river of water that's on fire does not put it out. You essentially have to smother it, right? You have to deny it oxygen, which is very difficult to do. So the Cuyahoga River is going to remain on fire in different patches. They're going to combust for several years after 1969. And it is dramatic evidence of just how polluted our water systems have become. There's a famous book published in the mid-60s by Rachel Carlson called Silent Spring, which is just one example of many, many studies that are coming out in the 60s and 70s about the health effects of a variety of different petrochemicals that have been produced. Rachel Carlson is particularly focused on insecticides, and one particular insecticide that was very popular in the 1950s and the 1960s called DDT. So we spoke a couple class sessions ago about the development of phosphate agriculture and how revolutionary that was in increasing crop yields all around the world. Well, a related component of that, which are also petrochemicals, are these insecticides. So we spray the crops to get rid of the insects. Which greatly increases their health and their growth. But DDT was a chemical. It was considered a kind of miracle chemical in the 1950s. It was produced, I believe, by Dow Company, but it was widely distributed around the world. When the United States wanted to give kind of development aid to poor countries, developing countries, we would deliver tons and tons of fertilizer and teach them how to fertilize their fields, and we would also give them insecticide. We'd tell villages in Central Africa, spray DDT around your village at night, and it'll eliminate all the mosquitoes and reduce the spread of malaria and whatnot. This is a miracle drug. Well, scientists that had studied DDT, and then Rachel Carlson kind of gathered together all their research into this famous book, found out just catastrophic health effects of that chemical DDT. A whole variety of cancers, liver cancers and kidney cancers, but almost equally important, certainly more shocking in terms of the visual evidence, a whole variety of fetal malformations. That is to say, babies being born, pregnant women ingesting DDT, and then producing children that had any manner of extra toes or too few toes, misshapen limbs, eyes in the wrong place on their face, just absolutely horrific consequences of pregnant women ingesting and being exposed to DDT. And then finally, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island in New Jersey has a meltdown in 1979. Now, it didn't explode. It wasn't like, if you're familiar with Chernobyl, the Russian nuclear reactor. 3 Mile Island was nothing like Chernobyl, but it did release that cooling water, which is contaminated water. That cooling water, essentially, there was a meltdown in the reactor. That cooling water, in effect, bubbled over, if you will, and spilled out into the surrounding water systems, the streams and canal systems around 3 Mile Island. And this would dramatically change Americans' attitudes towards nuclear civilian power. And as we mentioned before, lead to far more stringent safety regulations around nuclear power plants. So it's in 1970 that the first Earth Week is celebrated, and this is simply a kind of protest movement and celebration for a whole variety of environmentalist causes. There is an increasing awareness around this exact same time we're talking about these kind of hinge years, this period of the adjustment. There is a much greater realization of the potential climate and health effects of both petroleum itself and a whole range of petrochemicals that have been developed over the previous 20 years. This increasing awareness of the environmental impact of burning oil and the application of petrochemicals is going to lead to the first federal legislation of environmental impact. So we think of as environmental regulations. Now you got to recall, this is really a brand new exertion of federal authority. The federal government, prior to these acts that you see listed on the screen, really the National Parks Act back in the 19-teens is really the only significant federal legislation regarding climate and environment. So then we get a whole spate of laws here. The most important, if you see on your screen, in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, a brand new federal cabinet, federal department. And then of the others listed, the two most significant for our purposes are in 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed, and that was a very direct result of the Cuyahoga River fire, and the 1972 Clean Water Act. These are the foundational pieces of federal legislation. They will be greatly elaborated on in the decades to come, and a bunch of additional powers granted, but it was at this moment in 1970 to 1972, for the first time, EPA regulators and auditors are going to be going into private companies' factories, measuring the emissions coming out of that factory smokestack and ordering that company, you've got to spend $1 million to get an air scrubber installed in your smokestack because you can't have that much sulfur or that much mercury or, any of dozens of other toxic minerals and compounds. You have to spend a certain amount of money to get into compliance with the Clean Air Act. And similarly, too, with the Clean Water Act, there was a wonderful interview with a guy who worked in a factory at the Cuyahoga River, worked in a paint factory, who explained the way that they would test their paint durability is they would take, they have some new formula for paint. They want to know if it's better at being water resistant. You would take a piece of wood, you would splatter on the new formula paint, and you would just go stick it out in the Cuyahoga River and leave it for a couple of weeks. You come back and look at it, and you would kind of mark down how is the paint deteriorating. There's just no conception of the way that we could pollute our own environment. So laws like the Clean Water Act are now going to regulate what can factories have coming out of their drain pipes and dumping into lakes and rivers. So this is really the foundation of a whole range of federal regulatory laws that are, commonplace and kind of ubiquitous, pervasive today. They have their roots in these laws in the early 1970s. Now, the last point to make about this, you'll notice that's Richard Nixon up there, President Richard Nixon in the photo in the upper right-hand corner. These were up through 1976, all laws passed by a Republican president. Richard Nixon is a Republican. And that's kind of ironic to point out because, of course, in our current politics today, we think of environmental regulation as being very much a partisan issue. Democrats are mostly for environmental regulation, and Republicans are mostly opposed. It's a liberal thing to be in favor of environmental regulation, and it's a Republican thing to be opposed to environmental regulation for the sake of supporting business. It really is difficult for us to move back a half a century in time and to appreciate how bipartisan this issue was in its origination, right? It really was not a thing that separated Republicans and Democrats. It was one of the few things, in fact, that they could collaborate on and both vote for. So when Richard Nixon advocates for and signs into the law these different acts, it's essentially it's an act by a Republican president trying to reach out to, if you will, kind of moderate liberal voters and say, hey, look, I'm a progressive. You can vote for me. Why? Because I'm progressive on the environment. Of all the range of policy issues that Republicans had to stand firm on, environmental rules was one place where they could sort of reach across the aisle and cooperate with the other party. So it's one of the great ironies that the foundation, the major foundation stones of our modern environmental regulatory system were overwhelmingly signed into law by a Republican president. That being said, probably the most important of all of these federal acts, the National Energy Act, was passed in 1977 under President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. And because the National Energy Act is the most kind of overreaching, it's the greatest exertion of federal authority over the economy of all these acts. It's for that reason primarily that we associate environmental legislation with the Democratic Party, because President Carter, if Nixon sort of begrudgingly signed these acts as a concession to moderate liberals, Jimmy Carter and the Democrats were wholeheartedly in favor of and great advocates for the National Energy Act. The National Energy Act, passed in 1977, is going to be the first serious attempt in American history to limit Americans' consumption of oil. For the first time, we're going to be evaluating products, commercial products that are available to consumers for their energy usage. So you see those tags on the upper right-hand side of your screen. You've all seen the EPA fuel economy estimate sticker that is in all new cars that get sold. And then that energy guide is hopefully familiar with you. It is stuck on all manner of hot water heaters and refrigerators, washers and dryers, and all kinds of home appliances that tells you how much energy that appliance consumes. All of that is a requirement imposed on Kenmore and Whirlpool and all the manufacturers of these products by the National Energy Act. But by far, the most consequential element of the National Energy Act was its imposition of CAFE standards, that is, car and automobile fuel efficiency standards, and the lowering of the national speed limit to 55 miles an hour. Now, just take a moment and think about that. If you have been raised in the last quarter century, since the turn of the century in America, you have never seen a 55 mile an hour speed limit, at least not on a freeway. Imagine going from a 70 mile an hour speed limit and the government telling you now you have to you can maximally drive at 55 miles an hour. As someone who grew up in that era, I can tell you it was a total pain, and it felt like it took you forever to get where you were needing to go. And combine that with really serious enforcement, tons of police out with their radar guns on all the major freeway systems, writing tons of tickets for people driving over 55 miles an hour. Now you can see the impact of the CAFE standards. The CAFE standards, the car and automobile fuel efficiency standards, set what are called fleet averages, and that's an important concept to know. So the CAFE sets say the fleet standard has to be 22 miles per gallon. That means a company like Ford has to average among all the cars they sell, right, that they actually sell, not just put for sale, but that consumers actually buy, the average of those entire mix has to come out to 22 miles per gallon. So you can sell an F-150 with a V8 in it that only gets 10 or 12 miles to the gallon, but for every person who buys an F-150 from you, you have to sell two compact cars, right? A Pinto or something like that, a four-cylinder car that gets 28, 29, 30 miles to the gallon to compensate for that one pickup truck that you sold that gets 10 or 12 miles per gallon. So it's the fleet averages that are so important and that make the CAFE calculations so complicated and difficult. It's not just that I put up three different models of car for sale, one that gets 15, one that gets 22, and one that gets 29, so the average is 22. It's not just what I offer for sale, it's what your customers actually buy, right? The automobiles that your company actually puts on the street, the fleet average has to come out to whatever number Congress has set, and that chart on the lower left-hand part of your screen shows the slowly escalating standards that Congress puts in place. The primary chart in the middle of your screen there shows the consequences, the effects of imposing CAFE standards. All the way on the left, so what this is the five different colors represent fuel economy, right? So under 50 miles per gallon, 15 to 20, 20 to 25 miles per gallon, etc., etc. On the left-hand side of that chart in 1975, you see that nearly 70%, so roughly two-thirds of all the cars sold by U.S. auto manufacturers got less than 15 miles per gallon, right? So two-thirds are getting less than 15 miles per gallon. Jump up just 5 years to 1980, and it's less than 10%. It's something like 5% of all the cars sold are getting under 15 miles per gallon, and you see the distribution of increasingly better fuel economy throughout that mix. So the National Energy Act and the CAFE standards we'll see again in the coming class sessions when we look at changing energy consumption in the United States and the West. Things like the National Energy Act and the CAFE standards are going to have a dramatic impact on American consumption. It's not going to turn it around and make it start descending towards zero, but we're going to plateau that rapidly escalating curve that we've seen in the increasing energy use, especially in the United States and the Western European powers. That rapidly escalating curve upward is going to kind of flatten, level off into a flat plateau, and that is largely the effect of these attempts by America and the other Western powers to limit their citizens' consumption of gas. Now you have to imagine what a dramatic moment this is. We are 100 years into the history of the oil industry. Never before have any of these governments tried to prevent their citizens from consuming gas, right? The prosperity of the 20th century has been driven by new technologies that can consume more and more energy, right? That was the whole wave of the 1950s and the 1960s. Well, what the National Energy Act says is you have to use less. Right? And you can imagine the kind of resistance, the kind of political turmoil that these requirements lead to. And it's not hard to appreciate why Americans are so resentful and angry at the imposition of these requirements. You see here a series of car advertisements from the 1970s which dramatically illustrate how American values were changing. If you recall those car advertisements we looked at from the 1950s, those cars were enormous, right? And the human figures in the advertisements were very small. It was all about the kind of power of the machine. And look at how different these images are that you see on your screen. The AMC Gremlin, the new American car. Look at how tiny that car is in comparison to Uncle Sam. Now the character of Uncle Sam, who's a very tall character, right, is intended to exaggerate that difference. So the smallness of the thing is its value, right? And why, you can see in some of these captions in the Gremlin ad just below, it says relieve the fuel shortage, right? The pressure of the economic recession of the 1970s is creating a virtue in conservation. It is a good thing to use less. If you look at the Ford advertisement in the upper right, for the Ford Pinto, basic is when a car goes a long way on a little gas. Or the Honda advertisement, the less you spend on a car, the more you can spend on other things. And so they're trying to make a virtue out of necessity here, but the whole ethic here is really different than anything we've seen before. Conservation now in this context means consuming less. And you can see, if you're at all a car enthusiast, if you know anything about vintage cars, this crop of cars from the mid-70s are among the worst cars American automobile manufacturers have ever produced. They run terrible. They are essentially big block engines, just like those engines of the 50s, just made on a four-cylinder platform, right? They're essentially the same technology, just made smaller. It's actually the Japanese car companies, the Honda and Toyota, that are really going to make breakthroughs in high compression engines, which require much stronger steel and steel alloys, right, to make those engine blocks out of. But the American car companies are not going to get there really until the 1990s. The American car companies are going to make really bad, right? Small, fuel-efficient cars for about 2 decades. And you can see how desperate they are in that Pacer ad. You're supposed to look at that Pacer, and it's supposed to remind you, that rear window, of that woman's derriere, right? This is a sexy car, is what that ad is telling you. Well, there is nothing less sexy in the world than these cars. They're terrible, miserable, small. They're weak, right? You can't go very fast in them. They're not performance-based. All they do is consume less gas than the cars of the previous generation. And so there is a kind of cultural reaction to federal regulation. It is because of the federal CAFE standards that the American auto companies are producing these crappy cars. Now, if you're at all a car enthusiast, if you're at all familiar with the car market in the mid 2020s, and if you understand the Paris Climate Accord and what's happening to current car engines in our present day, you may have some sympathy for car enthusiasts of the 1970s who are absolutely furious at the federal government for imposing these rules that made the American auto companies produce these absolutely crappy cars. But as we'll see in a couple of class sessions, for as miserable as these cars are to drive and try to have fun in, they have a dramatic effect on limiting Americans' energy consumption. So if you take all of those things together that we've just been talking about, a kind of international organization for the consuming countries so that they can compete with and bargain with OPEC and the oil producing countries, the pursuit of new territories for oil production in Alaska and the North Sea, the development of alternate forms of energy with nuclear electric power, and then on the other side of it, a very stringent effort, or an effort for a very stringent set of regulations limiting Americans' oil consumption. If you put all that together, you see a packet of strategies which Jürgen is describing as the adjustment, which is indeed going to have a very substantial impact on the international oil economy, as we'll see in the coming class sessions.